Welcome to the Virtual Roadshow series, presented by Channel Check. This Fireside Chat features Brian Culley, CEO of Lineage Cell Therapeutics, NYSE ticker symbol LCTX. He is joined by Robert LeBoyer, Senior Research Analyst for Noble Capital Markets, a FINRA-licensed, SEC-registered broker-dealer. You can find Noble's research on Lineage Cell Therapeutics on channelcheck.com or by clicking the link in the description. With that, I am pleased to present Brian and Robert.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Robert LeBoyer, Senior Biotechnology Analyst at Noble Capital Markets. With me today is Brian Culley, the CEO of Lineage Cell Therapeutics, a company that has pioneered a cellular therapy in which they take early stage cells, grow them in sufficient quantities, and then transplant them for areas of damage and disease to restore both structure and function of the damaged tissue. So here to tell us about the lead program, OpRegen, is Brian Culley. Brian?
Good morning, Rob. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, you did a nice job. OpRegen, or actually, as it's now starting to be called, is RG6501, which reflects a partnership that we entered into with Roche and Genentech. OpRegen is basically a cell transplant. So what we do is we manufacture specialized retina cells. They're called RPE cells, and we transplant those cells to the back of the eye, because one of the leading causes of blindness in the world is called dry age-related macular degeneration, and the hallmark of that disease is the death or the loss of these RPE cells. When you lose those cells, you ultimately lose vision. And so what we do is we are replacing those cells. We have a technology that allows us to manufacture tremendous numbers of these RPE cells, and we transplant about 100,000 of them to the back of the eye. And we've seen some incredibly exciting early stage clinical data, which supported this alliance that we entered into with Roche and Genentech, which had a total value of $670 million plus double-digit royalties. So it's really an exciting time. It's what we think is, the early days of the validation of cell transplants as an entirely new branch of medicine.
So could you tell us a little bit about the payment and the milestones that are coming up?
Yeah, this to our knowledge, this was the biggest non-cancer cell therapy deal that's been done. There have been some acquisitions that had larger dollar amounts, but in terms of what we call a biobucks deal, meaning the total value that we're eligible for in payments, we think it was the largest deal that's been done. Certainly a large deal by any measure for a phase 1/2A asset. The deal came with $50 million up front. That's 50 million up front, which has already been received. And then there's an additional $620 million of milestones based on certain success criteria across both development and commercialization events. And then, as you correctly note, the royalties. So it was a really big deal. But more than the dollars, I think the even greater value from that is the validation. You don't have just this tiny little company working on this fascinating new area. You have the #1 company in the world in ophthalmology, Roche, placing a bet, and not a small bet, on this approach that we have been developing over many years. And I think that validation is exciting because it's not just validation for that one asset, but I think it offers some validation for our entire approach of replacing or transplanting cells, specific cells, not stem cells, not cells that don't have an identity, but actually manufacturing the cells that were lost and replacing that specific or differentiated type of cell to the body. And because we have a platform technology, we can do this again and again. So I think it is the beginning of an incredibly exciting time for the company, because it provides capital that allows us to reinvest. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit. It provides this validation of our approach. And I think it really distinguishes our company compared to many others by virtue of having accomplished what we have accomplished. And we don't have to pay for the development anymore. Roche and Genentech is going to take on substantially all of the costs of future clinical trials and ultimately commercialization. So, a lot of things to like about that transaction.
most of the products that I'm familiar with are in wet age-related macular degeneration. You're working in dry age-related macular degeneration. Could you just distinguish between the two in terms of what percentage of the patients are wet AMD and how many are dry AMD?
Yeah, sometimes there's overlap, but probably around 80 to 90% of people who develop macular degeneration develop what's called the wet form. And we have already successful medicine to treat the wet form of dry AMD. You and others listening may know people who receive monthly or every other month injections into their eye to treat their wet AMD. That I misspoke. I'd like to correct myself here for a moment. It's really more like 10 or 15% of people have that form, the wet form. Despite that small minority of wet AMD, those therapies for wet AMD do an enormous number of sales, upwards of $7-8 billion in sales. But the much larger opportunity here is to treat the other 80 to 90% of people who have dry age-related macular degeneration. Those are the individuals for which there is nothing approved. So you have this massive commercial opportunity looming out there for whoever it is that can unlock and get an effective and safe therapy for those patients. So I think there's a very compelling market opportunity. What's really interesting here is that it's not for lack of trying. People have been trying for many years to develop therapies to treat dry AMD. Our view is that dry AMD is mostly a disease of aging. You're outliving or exhausting your RPE cells. And so it's not like one little pathway has gone wrong and you can go in there and edit a gene or use a small molecule or antibody and fix it like you can in many other diseases. The whole cell is dying off. There are thousands of things going wrong before a cell literally breaks down and is no longer functional and is degraded into nothing. So we view the right path, the best opportunity to treat these patients is by giving them a brand new cell. We don't try and overthink it and get super clever about which pathway has gone wrong and fix that one pathway. We fix everything. We give you a brand new cell. So these are replacement parts for the body, which is what cell therapy has been promising for a long time. But it's happening. Now we can actually show the clinical data and very compelling evidence that what has been promised by these approaches is actually happening in the clinical setting.
Could you tell us a little bit about the function that's been restored and the actual benefits to the patients?
Yeah, the beautiful thing about working in the eye is you can look, right? We've got these high resolution cameras that can show you exactly what's happening back there. So we as an industry have an amazing ability to collect very high resolution anatomical information about the retina. The retina consists of about 9 or 10 layers of very thin tissue, discrete cell types, and you can use imaging technology to get a nearly histological level of analysis, meaning you can see each individual layer of the retina. So in the setting of dry AMD, as I described, when these retina cells die off, you can see the area that is devoid of the photoreceptors, devoid of the RPE cells. It's like a 9-layer cake that's collapsed down, and you get this what's called an area of geographic atrophy. So what we have seen is that by transplanting our OpRegen cells, we're actually able to restore some of these areas, especially around the periphery. So you think of this as like a wildfire that's expanding wider and wider. And what we're doing is we're planting seeds and we're starting to see new growth around the edges. So what that does is it effectively slows or stops the disease from expanding, which is something that no other approach has ever shown. And it's visual evidence, right? This is not a patient saying, well, I think I feel better. You don't have these subjective components. You can literally measure the size of these areas of atrophy and get very convincing evidence that you have made a positive change to the underlying anatomical structure. But the individual doesn't feel that change in their anatomy. So what the individual cares about is what you were just asking me about, which is function. So we have 5 patients now that have had this halting or reversal that have shown this area of improvement in their retina structure, the anatomy. And on average, they have had more than 12 letters of visual improvement. So that's, sitting in front of an eye chart and counting the rows. Usually there's 5 letters per row. So you're talking about moving down into the 3rd row. That is a very significant functional gain for these patients. So we're seeing anatomical structural improvements. We are seeing functional improvements in these patients, and those things together are what we feel give us a very clear advantage over other approaches that are being tried today and have not shown anything quite like what we have been able to show.
Could you tell us a little bit about milestones and the progress and what's ahead for the product?
Yeah, like a typical deal, there are a lot of milestones that are factored in, that as we reach certain development events, as the program moves forward, there are payments that Lineage will be eligible for, and as I shared on our recent quarterly call, some of those milestone events I do expect to be determined with the cash that we already have on hand. So it's unfortunate that I'm actually prohibited from saying exactly what the dollar amounts are. I'm prohibited from saying when they happen. It's frustrating for me as a CEO because I do want to, talk about, what we're doing and how close we're getting to these different events. But what I can say is that there's a sort of convenient thing that happens on the accounting side where we received the $50 million up front on a cash basis, but the way that you account for it under GAAP is you actually recognize revenue as work is performed. So over the last couple of quarters, we recognized, I think, somewhere around $9 million. So that gives you a sense for how much progress is happening with this program, that the revenue recognition has been so heavy. And I think it's fair to say that, Roche and Genentech are deeply committed to this program. They're throwing abundant resources at it. We are extremely happy with how this alliance is going. It is normal and natural for a program to be partnered with Big Pharma and to slow down a little bit, but that's a small trade-off for the much greater resources that company can bring to a program and help elevate its probability of success in the clinic, which is ultimately very important to all of us.
Spinal cord injury is an area where there's no real therapies and no real products in development, either for acute or clinical. Can you tell us a little bit about OPC1 and what the objectives are for that program?
The OPC1 program is really exciting because what we're talking about is manufacturing a different kind of cell, the cells that comprise your spinal cord. So you're talking about people who have suffered from a spinal cord injury, who have similarly lost that function. They've lost those cells, so they've lost that function, just like what I was describing in the eye. And we manufacture and transplant this other kind of cell. And in doing so, we're looking to help individuals regain function, regain mobility, right? That's your number one thing. Just like the people who are losing their vision, they just want to see. People who have suffered a spinal cord injury, they want to regain mobility. Mobility means independence. Mobility is quality of life. So that's exactly what we're doing. It has a great number of parallels with the dry AMD program. It's just a different cell type and a different patient population, but conceptually, and I hope, ultimately clinically, what we're doing is very similar. Make the cell type, transplant the cell type, and look for functional activity.
Where is the OPC1 program in clinical development?
30 patients have been treated with OPC1. 5 of them had a thoracic injury and 25 of them had a cervical injury. We're actually mostly focused on cervical injury patients, and that's because these upper cervical nerves, they feed out to your upper extremities. So if you think about the kind of mobility that you most want, it's really around your hands, your shoulders. That gives you the ability to manipulate your wheelchair. That gives you the ability to type. We had one person on a clinical trial who could barely move his shoulders, and then he could start to type 30 to 40 words per minute. That's incredible in terms of that young man's independence and his quality of life and his freedom. So that is really where we're focused, are these subacute injuries. So, a window shortly after the initial damage, 3 to 6 weeks after the initial injury, That's where we're mostly focused on cervical injury, so we can regain that upper extremity where we think the greatest level of independence, quality of life can be demonstrated. And then from there, we want to expand into other types of injuries and other regions of the spinal cord.
So one of the other programs you have is in immunology. Can you tell us a little bit about that and VAC2?
Yeah, this is our cancer program. What I like about this program is that it actually is a little bit of a platform within our larger technology platform. And that's because unlike the other programs that we've talked about so far, what we do here is we manufacture dendritic cells. And dendritic cells are mostly carriers of information. And they require information to be loaded into them. So they're envelopes and they're carrying this info. And the information that they carry is typically information that informs or educates the patient's immune system about how to detect tumor. And then once that tumor is detected, it can be destroyed. So you can think of this like a vaccine, right? We all have learned so much about COVID vaccines, the antigens, the spike protein, right? That same kind of technology is applicable here. So we manufacture dendritic cells and we put the mRNA that encodes for a tumor-specific antigen into those dendritic cells. And it's not the dendritic cell that performs the tumor-killing activity. The dendritic cell just carries that information and yells it into the ears of the patient's immune system. And by doing so, you are getting this we've seen clinically, very high levels of antigen-specific T-cell response. So again, if you think about this in terms of, because it's sort of accessible in this language, if you think about this in terms of coronavirus or COVID-19 vaccine efficacy, you want to have, why do we have boosters? You're continuing to tell the immune system, this is the thing you need to fight. It's the same with the dendritic cell. When you use a dendritic cell, which is nature's natural antigen presenting cell, you're using the best possible carrier of information. You're not just sticking an antigen in the body and hoping that it gets detected and presented. You are literally pre-packaging it into a dendritic cell and presenting it in the right way to the immune system. So we see these very high levels of immune reactivity to these antigens. But the tumor that you go after is unique to each antigen. So if you want to have a program for non-small cell lung cancer, as we do, you can pick a certain antigen. If you want to then go after colorectal cancer or pancreatic cancer, you could choose a different antigen, and you can still have that same platform, the same dendritic cells. It's just in the final step, you put a different piece of information into them, and now you've got a new product. So that's why I describe it as a platform within our much larger platform.
And could you also tell us a little bit about the research projects?
What we did was, when we received the $50 million from the Alliance, we thought about how we would reinvest that into new, research programs. And we went through this exhaustive process. I call this Lineage 2.0. And what we identified were two very compelling areas that we decided to go public on. And those were the manufacture of photoreceptor cells, which is the other really important cell type in your eye, and also the manufacture of auditory neurons, which are critical to your ability to hear. So what I was doing is thinking about how the success with the dry AMD program and that alliance with Roche, how could we capitalize? How could we repeat upon that success? Let's find additional ways that we could use our cell transplant technology and our cell transplant know-how and our cell transplant intellectual property and our manufacturing capabilities and so on. How do we use that to develop new programs? And so very quickly, we were able to launch two new programs where we can manufacture rods and cones. Those are the photoreceptor cells, and those are already in animal testing. And now we're also manufacturing auditory neurons, and those will similarly go into animal testing. And these are going to represent validation of promises that this company has made years ago, which was that we can go after very quickly and efficiently new areas of opportunity and continue to build and succeed with a pipeline, because your body is made up of 200 plus different cell types. So, it's not an endless supply of programs that we could have, but we certainly could go beyond where we are today. And photoreceptors and auditory neurons were two exciting areas that we wanted to get into.
And there's a question asking about your level of cash and whether you plan to whether you see the need to raise cash in the next 12 months.
It's a great question. I'm glad it was asked. Our last reported quarter, we had about $72 million of cash runway. Our normalized net operating spend the last couple of years was around 20 to 25 million. This year, I've guided that it was going to get closer to 30. I think we'll be below 30 for the year. So 72 million offers a lot of capital. A need, the answer to do we have a need for cash? No, but companies are opportunistic. We'll always be flexible about whether it makes sense. Often people don't get full visibility as to the decisions as to why companies raise money or not. So I think what's important is if you're not interested in raising capital, we don't have the urgent need to do so. But if we elect to do so, what I would say is there's a very good reason why we're doing it. It may be because we have new opportunities. It may reflect a view that we have of the markets. But the important thing is that if for some reason there was no liquidity and there was a massive recession, the company, as I shared in the last quarterly call, I said that we had multiple years of cash runway to execute on our plan. So the company is in very good financial health, in my opinion.
Another question asks, why do you think comparable companies have larger market caps when Lineage is further advanced in the clinic and partnerships?
I have a strong opinion on this. We just came out of an ultra frothy biotech environment. So there were companies out there that had some similarity to us, right? Cell transplant type looking companies that weren't even in the clinic and had $1 billion or greater valuations. And if you look at their charts, you see what happened, right? They all came cratering down because it wasn't based on fundamentals. It was somebody with a brand name and a brand name investor, and the punch bowl was overflowing. But there's been a reconciliation there. But I still think that what is not fully appreciated is that although some of those companies are now getting into the clinic and moving forward, many of those companies have not encountered problems that we've solved long ago, right? There was sort of this premium for newness. And Lineage is not new. Lineage used to exist almost 20 years ago in different ways, but underneath the water, there has been this advancement in our understanding, and you're seeing it reflected in our success, especially in places like our manufacturing. Our capabilities are, I think, without compare in that regard. And I'm reminded of, if I can just do a personal story for a moment, I'm reminded of an investment I made many years ago in a company called Tesla, where I bought a stock at $29, $30. And just a few months later, it was over $200. And I can tell you that the company was no different. They didn't launch any new programs. They didn't win any meaningful awards. It was the same darn company. It's just that people got there and they understood that there was some kind of mispricing or that it was worth a lot more. And I'm hopeful that we'll see that kind of experience with Lineage. I think that we can be worth a lot more than we are today. It will require the industry to continue to be very rigorous and critical and understand not just headline information about companies, but digging down and saying, well, just how many courses of clinical material can you actually manufacture, company X? And I think when you start asking some of those really tough questions, Lineage shapes up really well in comparison. So, I don't worry about daily share price. I don't worry about weekly share price, but I do pay attention to the short, medium, and long term. And the thing that's most exciting is the long term. This could be a very large company someday, and I'd like to help bring it there.
With that, do you have any closing comments that you'd like to make?
Yeah, no, look, I appreciate the opportunity. I love obviously talking about what we do, and I love doing what we do. And I think the future is very bright. We'll continue to be working very hard, and I think as we continue to get appreciated for what we're doing, good things ahead. So thanks for following our story, whether you're listening or whether you are a research analyst for the company. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today, Rob.
Thank you for joining us for this virtual roadshow presentation brought to you by Channel Check. View our YouTube channel for more video content, including C-suite interviews, virtual roadshows, and conference presentation replays. New content is added regularly, so subscribe below to stay up to date. Visit channelcheck.com or click the link in the description to access equity research, news, and advanced market data on this and the 6,000 other small and micro-cap companies listed.